The M1 Macs are amazing. Fast, well optimized, efficient, and just all around amazing devices. I've been using the 13-inch M1 MacBook Pro since February 2021, and it always has been in a weird position. It is priced just above the M1 MacBook Air, which can do most of what the Pro does, and just below the new redesigned M1 iMac, which has much better hardware. Should you save your money by getting the MacBook Air, or spend more of it on the iMac to get more for what you pay? Who is the MacBook Pro meant for? It's meant for only a very small group of people who are in a very specific situation. And today, I'll tell you the exact conditions your situation needs to satisfy in order to consider the M1 MacBook Pro instead of all the other options available to you. You need to know this first. The conditions that I'm about to state, your situation needs to satisfy all of these in order for the M1 MacBook Pro to be the perfect choice for you. At the end of this video, I'm also going to tell you which Mac to get in case you only satisfy a particular set of conditions. What can I say? I've got a big heart. And I'm basically here to help you take better decisions regarding tech. Alright, here's the first one. For anyone who's working from home or going to the workplace right now or will go to their workplace at some point in the future after getting vaccinated and taking the necessary safety measures, who needs a device which can do anything and everything they want, intense or simple, while also being usable outside your home or, not just stuck to one single spot at home, they should consider the M1 MacBook Pro. Despite of all the power and hardware inside it, the MacBook Pro is very compact and not that heavy. And honestly, do not tell me that you're gonna carry a whole iMac, no matter how light it is, along with you to whichever spot at your home you need to work from. That's not practical. And you're not gonna do it. The display on the MacBook Pro is really sharp and gets really bright. I've never really needed to use it on its maximum brightness unless really necessary. Colors are great enough that I can color grade all my videos. You could sit anywhere and place it on your lap and do the most intense, power-hungry tasks and it would not burn your thighs. The speakers are amazing and even better than what you find on the MacBook Air, along with a bigger trackpad while maintaining the same compact size. The battery life is also great enough that you can spend a very long time away from power outlets, but more on that later. And whenever I need to sit at a desk and do my work on a much bigger screen, I could always just dock the MacBook Pro with a single wire connected to a dongle, which connects it to a display and better speakers and brings in more I/O, all while the MacBook is being charged. The display will obviously not be as good as it is on the iMac, but it can be a good color accurate Quad HD panel, and the price would be just as much as the price difference between the MacBook Pro and the iMac. So this way you get the portability you need and the versatility to use the MacBook Pro in a desk setup while never sacrificing on power. The MacBook Pro has unreal battery life, and 6 months later, it is still unreal for me. For the less power-hungry tasks like watching movies, videos, scrolling through the internet, it hardly reduces the battery. I've used it for 7 to 8 hours doing daily tasks, having around 8 to 10 tabs open on Chrome, and the battery would go down by around 35 to 40%. And if the usage goes up till 12 hours, I would usually end up with 70% lost at the very most. Unreal. The MacBook Air is only a small step behind in terms of battery life when compared to the Pro, but still it's better than almost all of the other laptops that come in a similar price range or even higher. Not even almost. It's better than all of them. The only way for me to kill the MacBook Pro's battery within a day would be to edit videos on it without the laptop being plugged in. And even then, it would take at least 7 to 8 hours to do that. And that is me editing 80 to 100 gigs worth of footage and sometimes even more, grading it, keyframing effects and plugins. All of this works because the M1 MacBook Pro needs much less power to output high performance. Because of such an efficiency, it remains cool most of the time. Hence, the fan inside it does not have to run a lot to keep the processor from heating up and dipping in performance. Because of which, Even lower power is consumed over a long period of sustained performance, resulting in battery life which is unbelievable. So if you need a Mac which can last a day or even more on its battery without being charged, this is the Mac to go for. Even after 6 months of its launch, there are some apps which do not natively work on the M1 processor. For most of such apps, there is Rosetta 2, which basically converts all of these apps made to work on Intel Macs to work on an M1 Mac simultaneously while you're using them. The internal efficiencies of M1 make these apps work like butter even when they're being simultaneously converted to work on a different processor. The only hiccup I ever faced was that it takes a few seconds for the app to open for the first time after you have installed it, but for every time I open it after, it opened instantly. There is a certain kind of smoothness that I never really felt before with the apps that have been optimized for the M1 Macs. Even if it were a first-party Apple app on an Intel Mac, they just work much smoother on the M1 Macs. Things just open fast, work even faster. The smoothness and speed is undeniable, even for apps which perform a lot of intense tasks like Final Cut Pro. The same thing applies. Shifting from a base 16-inch MacBook Pro to the M1 MacBook Pro, the difference for me is night and day. I could throw in everything on the timeline and the MacBook Pro would not break a sweat. I could be editing 4K streams, stacked one over the other, applying a color grade to multiple clips at the same time, and a whole lot of other editing mumbo jumbo, and it would all still be instantaneous and smooth. If I had a penny for every time I appreciated the smoothness of this MacBook Pro, I would have another MacBook Pro. But there are still some problems. Yes, Final Cut Pro works amazingly well, but if you depend on third-party plugins a lot, you might want to confirm before buying an M1 MacBook Pro that all of these plugins support M1 natively. Every few days, support for M1 is being added by more and more developers, but still, I would still recommend you to check before you buy. Apart from this, if you use apps which perform a lot of intense tasks and do not have the native support for M1, I would recommend to not buy any of the M1 devices yet, especially if you depend on the Adobe suite a lot. Although Photoshop and Lightroom already have native support for M1, Premiere Pro is still in the beta stage when it comes to working on M1, and other apps like After Effects do not ideally work on the M1 Macs yet. If you work with any app which has a heavy dependence on graphics, again, avoid the M1 Macs, because the M1 Macs lack the raw power of a GPU, for which is needed to deal with tasks that require the same. So once you're sure that most of the apps that you require have native support for M1 or work well with Rosetta 2, do not depend on a dedicated GPU, or can work with M1 despite the lack of something like it, only then go for the M1 MacBook Pro or any M1 device for that matter. The MacBook Air and the MacBook Pro are extremely similar to each other. The Air has a display which lacks a small bit of brightness, speakers half a step behind, a trackpad which is a tiny bit smaller when you compare it with the MacBook Pro. These differences do not really count that much, but a thing which is missing with the MacBook Air, which can make a difference, is a fan inside it, which the Pro has. Okay, let's understand this. Fans inside laptops and PCs are there to avoid the processor from heating up. If there is no fan inside a laptop or a PC, when the processor is performing an intense task, it tends to heat up, and when it starts heating up too much, there is a throttle in the performance, which basically means that there will be a dip in performance. This dip happens to avoid the processor from overheating. But the M1 is very power efficient, because of which it does not heat up much. Hence, you can use the MacBook Air to perform intense tasks, but with a time limit on it, as at some point the processor heats up enough that it needs to cool down, and since the Air does not have a fan, it takes a dip in the performance. But that does not happen with the MacBook Pro, as whenever the processor starts heating up, the fan kicks in to manage the heat. I'm a fan of that, and hence there is no dip in the performance. This does not apply in places where you need high performance in only short bursts. For those tasks, MacBook Air is more than enough. But for tasks like video editing, which require sustained high level of performance for as long as possible, you need the MacBook Pro. It is expected that by 7th June, which is the date where the WWDC starts, an event by Apple for developers. Apple will be coming out with redesigned MacBooks with the second iteration of the M1 processor, which is expected to be more powerful, more pro-focused. Because to be honest, the M1 Mac Mini, the MacBook Air, and the MacBook Pro were supposed to be devices which were there to help transition the consumers and developers to Apple's own silicon. Hence, Apple decided to put their new in-house developed chips inside old but familiar looking devices. But since these devices are pro-focused, I would say that they're going to be a bit more expensive than the current devices. So my suggestion, if you are on a limited budget but also want something that is very powerful right now, here's what you could do. You get the M1 MacBook Pro right now, spec it out to suit your needs, use it for the next 1 or 2 years, and sell it whenever you can to buy the more powerful redesigned Macs whenever you have the budget for it. The spec'd out MacBook Pro will fetch a good resale value, as all Macs do, and for the time being, you get to use a very powerful machine to do all your work, while also not spending a lot more money. But the second option, which is obviously the better option, is to wait till 7th June, see what Apple shows on WWDC, and then accordingly take a decision. If those MacBooks cost too much and you are in a limited budget, buy the MacBook Pro right now, spec it out to your needs, don't break the bank, use it for 2 years, sell it whenever you can, upgrade to the latest Macs at that point. There were a lot of Bluetooth issues initially, but with time they have sorted out. But still, so far I still see a lag in connection. So whenever I use something which is connected via Bluetooth, which is not made by Apple, there would be some lag here or there. Letters being typed in too late, or the movement of the pointer not being as smooth when connected to a mouse. Of course, when I tried shooting, it would just work fine, but trust me, it happened. One of the major issues that still persists is a new Bluetooth device not showing up at all, or not connecting even after showing up. And to fix this, I would have to restart the laptop again, and then I would actually get to connect the device. The I/O is very limited. You only have 2 Thunderbolt ports on one side, a headphone jack on the other, so you will have to carry dongles in your bags. I honestly have adapted to it after using MacBooks for 3 years with just USB-C ports on either side. But for a lot of people, it can be troublesome, so you should know this. Touch bar is here on the MacBook Pro. I have grown to be okay with it, and it honestly is. The whole hatred for it started when the touch bar basically froze, and you would have to restart the laptop to make it work again. And since it performs a lot of essential functions, freezing was a big issue. That honestly has never happened to me with my use, even on 16-inch and right now with the M1 MacBook Pro. As for actually using the touch bar, I use it when I have to. Yes, using keys to decrease or increase your brightness or volume is still much better, but touch bar is still here. And if you satisfy all the conditions that I stated earlier, M1 MacBook Pro is obviously the ideal choice for you, because of which you will have to learn to live with the touch bar. Think of it like a younger sibling. You didn't ask for it, but now that it's here, you have to accept it and be fine with it. When you are placing the order for the MacBook Pro, get 16 gigs of RAM, not 8 gigs, because 8 gigs of RAM can very quickly run out. 16 gigs of RAM is a good way to future-proof it, and much better if you have any sort of work which is even remotely heavy. So here is how you decide which M1 Mac to go for. If your current situation satisfies all the conditions stated above, I repeat, all of them, go for the MacBook Pro. I was in this specific group of people, and I got it. If you are looking for something portable, if your workflow is dependent on apps which have support for M1, or work on M1 easily with Rosetta 2, and you want a laptop to stay on for a day, get the MacBook Air. If you do not really need portability, your apps work easily on M1, and you want a fan so that you get the sustained consistent performance, better speakers, better hardware, more ports, get the new M1 iMac. If you already have a great display, speakers, keyboard, mouse, get the M1 Mac Mini. But before all of this, wait for 7th June. As for my experience with the M1 MacBook Pro, it has been really great for me. It is versatile while also being efficient and perfectly fits my needs and my workflow. Moving to it from my 16-inch MacBook Pro has been one of my better decisions. Sold it to avoid selling it for pennies when the newer Macs come out. So if you find yourself in a situation which satisfies all the conditions that I stated earlier, get the MacBook Pro. You will not regret it, but will cherish the upgrade. I hope this helps you out. Comment any questions that I may not have answered through this video. I will make sure I try my best to get to all of them. Like the video if you liked it, subscribe if you loved it. Helps the channel out, helps me out. Share this video with the people who are confused about the M1 MacBook Pro or M1 Macs in general, or which Mac to get. This will help them out, and again this will help me out, and you get some brownie points. Thank you for watching. I'll talk to you real soon in the next one.